morning, everyone. Welcome to NASA's 2020 Summit, and welcome to Memory as Resistance, a public panel co-hosted with George Washington University. So thank you all for coming on a Sunday morning, and welcome all of our online participants. Before we go into the panel, I have a few house cleaning items to announce. First of all, for this event, we are enforcing George Washington University's COVID policy. So if you're not wearing masks, please go to our registration desk. We offer free masks, and please keep your mask on for all time except from the time that you're eating. And we will provide some free lunch today, so feel free to go grab some food after the panel outside. But we will have a continuous event of the NASA Summit here in the same venue. If you're interested in attending the rest of the day's program, feel free to go to our registration desk. We have a special discount for you, $30 for the rest of the events today. If not, you're welcome to stay there, use lunch, and socialize with other participants and the panelists. Without further ado, let's start our panel. So thank you for coming. My name is Jun Lin. I'm the 2022 NASA Summit local director. I will be speaking in my personal affiliation, though I'm also a senior program officer for Asia programs at Freedom House. And the topic today is really dear to my heart as a Taiwanese and a Taiwanese American. Before coming to DC, I was a Sunflower Movement activist in Taiwan, and I spent a few years working in the political, nonprofit, and legislative sector. And I came to DC in 2016, where I began my work with the Taiwanese American community. And then I soon realized the history and the stories of the Taiwanese American community here built before Taiwan was democratized. A lot of the community members were Taiwanese activists who were blacklisted during the authoritarian time and under white terror. And after getting to know them, I realized this is actually a missing piece in the mainstream history of Taiwan because they play such an important role in the grassroots diplomacy and international collaboration with for Taiwanese and the international community, especially when we have been facing consistent exclusion and oppression from certain regime for us to participate in international community. And throughout that experience, it opened my eye to the space of foreign aid in the United States. And that's how I got to know a lot of the great panelists we have today. That's how I got to know other communities who has been facing, in my opinion, similar challenges and opportunity that Taiwanese American community has faced back in the days. Some of the characteristics that's similar. For example, Taiwanese went through a long period of time that lacked international presence and voices amplified in the international space. There were a long history of time where Taiwanese Americans' advocacy and diplomacy goal doesn't really align with the then administration at the time. And even till now, as you know, a lot of the international effort from Taiwanese and other communities, including Hong Kong, Tibet, and Uyghurs, has been facing increased authoritarian influence from the CCP, including digital surveillance, propaganda, or even transnational repression of physical attack in person. So today, I'm really thankful to be here, and I really thank NASA and George Washington University to give us this platform that allowed this kind of dialogue to happen. In addition to NASA and George Washington University, I want to give special thanks to our co-sponsor that includes Sigurd Center for Asian Studies of the George Washington University University, North American Town Studies Association, George Washington's East Asia National Resource Center, and also Taiwan Education and Research Program. And without further ado, I would like to introduce our amazing panelists today. So first, I'd like to welcome Anna Kwok. Anna Kwok is the Strategy and Campaign Director of Hong Kong Democracy Council. She played an important role, led and organized several international campaigns during the 2019 Hong Kong movement, and she's currently in DC convening a lot of important activities related to Hong Kong. And next is Eric Schussel. Eric is an assistant professor of history and international affairs here at George Washington University. He's also a specialist in the Uyghur past and present since 2015. And he also has a forthcoming translation of Indispensable Uyghur History in Uyghur Homeland. So please stay tuned for his book. And last but not least, I'd like to welcome Soljun Gyatso. He's from the Central Tibetan Administration. He's currently a Chinese liaison officer at the Office of Tibet in DC. He's also born in Tibet, and he escaped to India when he was 13 years old. And in addition, I would like to also wish a belated happy birthday to His Holiness the Dalai Lama. And we hope that he had a wonderful birthday, and we thank for his contribution in the human rights and democracy space. So today, I will have three of our panelists to share a 10 to 15 minutes presentation about what the community that they're working with and the community that they're in about their Uyghur, Tibetan, Hong Kongers social movement and cultural preservation effort. Then we will have about 25 minutes moderated Q&A where I hope I can facilitate some sort of conversation across the community to talk about our experience and potential challenges and opportunity we're facing. And then I'll open the floor to the audience here in person and the audience online. Thank you. And without further ado, let's welcome Anna for her presentation. Thanks.
Testing. First of all, thank you for having me. And it is definitely my honor today to share as a petitioner who has been involved in the Hong Kong movement, both in Hong Kong and overseas. And as an exile today, I really value the very important experience and the very important discussions that we're having right now on how Hong Kong can proceed forward. So when I was first invited to the panel, I think the word culture really stood out to me. As an exile, I always have to ask myself, how are we going to preserve the culture when we are abroad and when Hong Kong is essentially in exile? And I believe that is an age-old question for diasporas across the world. But before we attempt the question, I think it's necessary to ask, what is culture? So I've been watching this game show that is shot in Hong Kong, and even though I'm not in Hong Kong, I still try to watch and consume a lot of media products that are from Hong Kong. And this is definitely a form of culture. But so are the novels from Ai Hong and the song Glory to Hong Kong. And even calling the Hong Kong's new chief executive his nickname Pikachu instead of John Lee is considered a form of culture, right? So there are really a lot of things that you can say as part of culture. And when I mention these terms and invoke these cultural symbols, Hong Kongers or people who follow Hong Kong closely can immediately understand what I'm referring to. And for someone who doesn't even know who I am, just by listening to what I'm saying, they can easily understand which faction of Hong Kongers I do belong to. So essentially, culture is really to connect people by influencing and providing a coherent understanding of certain collective identity, background, and context. In other words, culture is a form of the collective consciousness. And preserving culture is essentially about preserving our sense of being a collective called Hong Kongers. Now, let us get a bit into how the identity of Hong Kongers is formed. Hong Kong had a distinct history of being a British colony for 99 years. After the notorious handover from the British to Chinese colonizers in 1997, since the new regime ruling us is of the same racial descent, our society actually faced a dilemma on whether to call ourselves Chinese or Hong Kongers. But as time went on, I think the answer became more and more apparent. I still remember how it was clear to me as a kid that we did not have the same lived experience as mainland Chinese. For example, Hong Kongers commemorate the June 4th massacre when the city still had some degree of autonomy and freedom. So you can see that the space for remembering history actually substantiates a fundamentally different consciousness of who we are and who belongs to our same collective. And before 2014, even though the identity of being a Hong Konger is still relatively fake, yet people in Hong Kong attempted to differentiate ourselves from the identity of being a Chinese in China through having events like these. And it was also through events like these that it became apparent to us that how we're actually different and how we actually are forming a culture of our own. And the identity solidified as time went on. In 2019, the umbrella movement took place. And since then, Hong Kongers have the collective social memory of actually camping out there in Admiralty like this. And it was through these physical gatherings and the movement that the term Hong Kongers get affirmed every day by ourselves. Through slogans and chants or songs and a lot of cultural products, it became more and more apparent that the identity of Hong Konger get asserted repeatedly, and it became a sense of belonging of all of us in the city. And since then, the slogan "Hong Kong is not China" began to take its root. And you can see this very famous flag that I think a lot of you might have seen before from news from Hong Kong. And we have evolved into separating ourselves from the identity of being Chinese. And we have grown into being just Hong Kongers instead of being Chinese or Chinese in Hong Kong. But before 2019, the sense of Hong Kongers were mostly birthed and perpetuated by physical events such as protests and assemblies, which I've shown earlier. But in the 2019 decentralized movement, the identity of Hong Kongers would actually expand to online and virtual collaboration across border. I had the experience of leading a global newspaper advertisement campaigns where we placed French page advertisements across the world in 13 countries, including on the headline of the New York Times. This was a radically different experience of being a Hong Konger, because this time, when we assert our identity of a Hong Konger, it's no longer about being physically together at the same space or even on the same soil, but instead we have brought the identity of Hong Kongers abroad, and we have brought the identity across borders, and that it no longer only exists in physical proximity, but it exists in the virtual space and media space across the world. And throughout the 2019 movement, because of initiatives like this, more and more networks were formed around the political culture of Hong Kongers. Whether it's songs, memes, online forums, or any sort of these cultural products, the networks have become a more powerful motivator for people to group together. And because of the many powerful networks that we have formed, the CCP has decided on cracking down on all these networks and platforms with the enactment of the National Security Law, which I'm sure a lot of you have heard about and are familiar with. But it's not only the people, it's also our culture and our identity have also went into exile because of the NSL. So these are some cultural products in exile that can no longer be seen properly in Hong Kong. For example, the film Revolution of Our Times and May You Stay Forever Young. These are films that you cannot see in theaters in Hong Kong. And even the illustration shown here, the illustrator actually went into exile just because of how dire the situation in Hong Kong is. And in the city of Hong Kong right now, people can no longer state that they're Hong Kongers without political risk. The politically correct identity right now would be to say that they're Chinese or they're Hong Kong Chinese. So our identity is essentially under attack. We are getting punished for stating that we're Hong Kongers. And you can no longer commemorate June 4th, organize protests, or participate in civil disobedience without a hefty price to pay. So the government is really trying to eliminate all possible space for us to assert our identity as Hong Kongers. And not only that, they're also eliminating space where the identity of Hong Kongers were birthed. When you no longer have a coherent identity in your diaspora or in your community, you cannot organize any resistance against the regime. And that is why, as our people, culture, and identity are being criminalized, simply remembering our culture and identity is already actually a form of resistance. And what's more, asserting and advancing our sense of identity is already a form of activism. And that's why here I say that I am a Hong Konger, not a Chinese, and I'm from Hong Kong, not China. Right now, Hong Kong's social movement is essentially about asserting the identity of Hong Kongers as opposed to asserting our identity of being a Chinese or a Hong Konger Chinese, which is something that the CCP has been trying to do. However, the culture and identity of Hong Kongers are in a process of constant deconstruction and reconstruction. As the government attempts to deconstruct our sense of identity by limiting space and erasing networks, what we are trying to do is to try to expand the space and promote the sense of identity of Hong Kong. And since 2014, our sense of identity has been reshaped and redefined by the movement, from being just something different than being a Chinese to having something on our own, to having something that is of our own culture. And going forward, the construction, deconstruction, and reconstruction continues. And as a practitioner right now working at HADC, who's trying to figure out what the next steps of our diaspora is, there are several obstacles and doubts and concerns that I face on a daily basis. So first, it's definitely a battle of cultures between the Hong Kong that the CCP tries to put forward and the Hong Kong that we are living as exiles. And secondly, there would be a tension between the local Hong Kong culture versus the culture where the host country of exiles have. So for example, when I am in the US, we organized a film screening for Revolution of Our Times. And there was a question of who our audience should be. Should our audience be Hong Kongers or should our audience be Americans? And which factions of Americans are we really targeting? So these are very daily questions that we face. And there's constantly a fear of assimilation and losing our culture in that process. And that's why going forward, I think I really appreciate the panel today because I do hope to learn more from different diasporas and different groups. For example, I think Taiwan has done a great job in keeping their own culture intact, even though having been, localized in different countries and adapting to different countries' system and culture. And as Hong Kong's collective consciousness and identity become less and less geographically spaced because people are in exile, I envision our community to become a political diaspora where everyone not only remembers, but is hyper aware of our collective identity as Hong Kongers through remembering our ultimate political goal of liberating Hong Kong. Therefore, it's up to us now to preserve our culture, remember our history, and continue to keep constructing new meanings and ideals for being a Hong Konger. Thank you.
And next, let's welcome Eric.
Good morning. Thank you to the organizers of this event for having me here as a member not of the diaspora itself or the movement, but as I hope an ally and someone who can share some observations about successful strategies and hopeful strategies that I've seen emerging within the Uyghur diaspora abroad in the US and elsewhere. I've been asked to use the pronunciation Uyghur instead of Uyghur, which is more common in English. I'll be saying Uyghur throughout the presentation. Now, I want to, thank you. As I said, I want to emphasize something kind of optimistic and hopeful here today and take us out of the usual perspectives and paradigms you might expect when speaking about the Uyghur movement abroad. I want to talk about print culture, poetry, literature, and the incredible importance that literary production, especially print culture, books and magazines have for Uyghur identity and the maintenance of the Uyghur community. Indeed, 6 years ago, prior to the 2017 crackdown in which perhaps 1 million people were rounded up and put into re-education camps and prisons, and many of the people you see here on the screen, the public intellectuals who are seen as many of the leaders of Uyghur culture, before 2017, when these people were disappeared, rounded up, were sentenced to lengthy prison sentences. If you walk down a street in Urumqi, the capital of the Xinjiang Uyghur Autonomous Region, if you knew where to look, you'd be struck by the sheer number of small independent bookstores. I mention this because, Thank you. The prominence of bookstores comes in many ways from not only an ancient centuries-old reverence for the written word and for poetry and for literature, but also a tradition in Uyghur intellectualism that dates back more than a century, in which ideals are seen as having liberatory power. The power of ideas and of poets to bring a kind of liberation, peace, independence, sovereignty to a group of people has been central to Uyghur intellectual discourse for a very, very long time. And in a discourse which has taken place in the Uyghur language, in many ways separately from Chinese literary and intellectual discourse. And that has survived during this time, despite periods of dominance by Stalinism, for example, and later by Maoism. Uyghur writers, such as Kutbu Kaji Shelpi or Abdurrahim Utku, have written works that are essentially in this idealist paradigm that come from a very common post-colonial or colonial perspective that while the dominator might have the weapons and the power and the guns, we have the spirits. And although they might have written in seemingly materialist paradigms in order to conform to the demands of the state, nevertheless, this idea that books will lead the way has persisted. Some of the people on the screen here, Abdul Qadir Jalaluddin, former professor of literature at Xinjiang Normal University, who is now serving a lengthy prison sentence, has written before, "Where are the supermen, the Übermensch," drawing on Nietzsche, who will lead our people into the future by bringing enlightenment. Yalkun Rozi, who is up here as well, very prominent public intellectual, has also been sentenced to 15 years in prison, supposedly for, what is the charge? Inciting subversion of state power by including too much Uyghur content in the textbooks that he was editing. So since 2017, we have seen a major crackdown of this kind of production and an isolation of Uyghur culture, those bookstores. Now, although you can certainly still buy books and magazines and newspapers in Uyghur in the region, I just want to make something clear here. The old literature is largely gone. Even works that were commissioned by the state have been banned from shelves, and their authors have been punished and imprisoned. The new books that are in Uyghur are tightly controlled by the state and are frequently translations directly from Chinese. So they're not coming from the community itself. They're being given to the community from above. Now, I bring this up in part because it's not just about the books. How can I? There it is. There we go. These bookstores were also important independent spaces for forming different kinds of cultural and social discourses, which are often very critical of current events, which allow people to articulate Uyghurness, Uyghur identity beyond the strictures of public space. So literary salons would take place in the back. You would stand around in bookstores reading books. High school students would go after school, find the place where they left off last time and treat the bookstore like a lending library. And so this really is a critical space of maintaining independent Uyghur thought. It's beyond the bookstores, there's, and I emphasize this because people are often surprised by this, there's a tremendous production of literary and scholarly journals in the Uyghur homeland, which has been sustained for decades as a way of articulating questions about Uyghur past and identity and culture in a discourse that is rarely translated to or from Chinese. Now, with 2017 and this massive crackdown, you might think that that would spell the end of this independent intellectual tradition. But like I said, I'm here to be hopeful. This has found a new life in the diaspora. As people who remember this vibrant print culture and these literary salons have sought to reconstruct them in Uyghur diaspora communities around the world. Here we have the example of the Teknomakan Uyghur Press based in Istanbul, also the Kutbu Bilik Press and others, which are fully reproducing everything you might see on those bookshelves back in the 2010s, the early 2010s. If you walk into the storefront or go to their online shop, you'll find not only works that were available then, but also works that were banned previously, and new publications by Uyghur scholars, intellectuals, poets, and authors in the diaspora. And so Moreover, we even see the revival of literary and scholarly journals and magazines, maintained largely on a volunteer basis by exile scholars who are continuing to preserve and articulate these sets of questions. Their efforts are supported by a massive, massive movement online to digitize Uyghur culture as well. There are at least 2 major ebook sites where tremendous amounts of, obviously it's a legal gray space, but tremendous amounts of print matter are available. And you can even find tens of thousands of articles produced before and after 2017 in China and in exile by scholars, making this kind of heritage, this kind of body of constant articulation of culture, like that I was talking about, available to a diaspora no matter where these people might be. Now, what these spaces also do is they open up new kinds of debate that were not possible before, one might say, within China itself. For example, debates in this magazine over what the direction of the Uyghur diaspora ought to be in the future. Should it maintain the secular identity of the urban educated elite, or should it perhaps turn more towards the more thoroughly Islamic identity, influenced by those who have gone to exile in Central Asia, and then perhaps in Saudi Arabia or Syria or Turkey? These are debates that could not happen back home. Speaking of such contestation, diaspora scholars have also continued to produce the kinds of work that either they planned to produce before going to exile many years ago, or were waiting for an opportunity to do so. For example, we have the Uyghur Research Institute based in Istanbul, which is helping to publish this 13-volume new history, a general Uyghur history, based on original research. It's high-quality scholarship, being sponsored by diaspora scholars. Many of whom actually might originally come from the hard sciences, which used to be considered safe things to study if you went abroad, but who have now turned to the humanities and the social sciences in the interest of maintaining and expanding this important, this critical dimension of Uyghur culture. Similarly, the Paris-based European Uyghur Institute, run by Dr. Dilnur Reyhan, a sociologist, not only organizes publications, but also conferences, which ensure that Uyghur voices are coming to the center of international scholarly discourses about Uyghur homeland and its issues. So this is really remarkable. Everything I've described here has sprung up only in the past few years through grassroots Uyghur agency. I find this particularly fascinating because it's happened outside the usual organizational frameworks that you expect from political activism in the diaspora. This isn't coming from the usual political actors or Rabia Qadr, the World Leader Congress, or anything like that. This is largely coming from people who decided it was their time to make a contribution. They found some web space and they went for it. But a lot of the political activism, I think, was a lesson about this, because in 2017, with the crackdown, China basically removed the thing that was keeping people from speaking out abroad. Previously, people had operated within essentially official discourse in many ways, because they didn't want to run afoul of the authorities back home or put their family or friends in danger. After 2017, when so many people were cut off from their families, when so many important people were placed into prisons, all bets were off, essentially. But with the hashtag #MeTooUyghur movement, for example, it's a problematic hashtag, but it worked. Uyghurs across the world began posting grassroots videos asking China, where are my relatives? And it turned out that this kind of grassroots people power in multiple languages across Turkey, Germany, Kazakhstan, America, Canada, anywhere in the world where Uyghurs were, I think it showed people that actually they had this generalized power to speak out for themselves using these widely accessible social media tools. Moreover, I think there's a real irony here that as the PRC has sought increasingly to control the narrative of the Uyghur past, present, and future, it's actually really lost control of it, because it's now come to have a new life abroad. You can either absorb officially licensed narratives and propaganda at home, or you can go abroad and have relatively free and open inquiry and see this lively debate-filled discourse about Uyghurness and Uyghur identity. And so I think the other great sea change is coming from a generational shift. As younger people are less afraid and they see certain tools at their disposal. If I may be so bold, I think often the older generation has tried to articulate a singular, powerful, authoritative vision of Uyghur identity, whereas a younger generation seems much more interested in exploring its complexities, and its diversities and pluralities. Camp Album, for example, is one of the projects which is sought to gather a set of different voices and reflections from multiple perspectives through art, literature, and scholarship on the traumas of the past several years. Similarly, the London-based Taran network, which I have particular admiration for, runs a popular podcast in which they highlight the many identities of Uyghur diaspora people around the world and show that these are professionals with something to give to their communities, not only as Uyghurs, but as people and citizens and members of their societies. There's a celebration of Uyghurness which goes beyond the political and helps to form networks of mutual supports and mutual care that I think, and I'm happy to be corrected, but I think are leading to a more vibrant, happier, supportive community abroad. This network also offers, for example, an online course in Uyghur history that doesn't just impart a narrative, it's seminar style. It invites questioning. You read scholarship, it invites debates. Apparently, they ran for the first time this summer. It got over 80 people to sign up for it too. So whatever they're doing, it's reaching audiences around the world. So I was privileged also to attend, I'll just give a really good example here. The launch of one of the Taran Network's projects, yes, Uyghur Anthology. This is a new collection of art, prose, and poetry by Uyghurs in the diaspora, primarily youth. It's a project that encouraged creative reflections such as these on what it means to be Uyghur. And many of those reflections made it into an often very powerful and moving, I really recommend this book, moving collection of poetry and artwork, reflecting on the memory of homelands, but also on the experience of never having that homeland to begin with, say, being born into a political movement that you didn't choose, but that nevertheless affects you profoundly. I remember one of the people in this anthology spoke about the disjuncture of identity, growing up in a third country in Central Asia, speaking one language of being Uyghur, then moving to another and being an immigrant and being Asian and diaspora and Uyghur and trying to figure out what that meant for himself. Of course, that trauma has led to another important instance of mutual support, and that is the attempt to resolve the sorts of issues of trauma through psychological aid. And I'm going to end on this because, again, I think it's very optimistic. And I think it shows one way that Uyghur youth are actually defining both their community and the CCP at the same time. There's such a stigma around psychological illness, trauma, and mental health in the Uyghur community, but people like Mustafa Aksu here, seen in a New York Times article, have made heroic efforts to ensure that the people in their community have access to the resources that they need to heal each other and to support each other. So in many ways, I would say, I'm trying to mirror the opening image here. The Uyghur youth experience seems to reflect the broader experiences of diaspora spurred by exile and the kinds of tensions that emerge in community when political commitments are intertwined with personal and family relationships. But those tensions seem to be opening up a new and dynamic space for thinking about what it means to be Uyghur in a new and very online world. So I will simply express my admiration for my colleagues and friends in this movement and leave with that.
Thank you so much, Elliot. And last but not least, let's welcome Solstrom to the stage.
Thank you, June, for the great introduction. And then thank you, Anna, and thank you, Eric, for the great presentation. And I just realized, Eric, that I met you at Mustafa's party. So it's really great to see all of you here. So let me also thank you, Seeger Center for Asian Studies and the Elliott School at the Elliott School of International Affairs and North American Taiwan Studies Association for organizing this great event. and having me to put Tibet on the table. Speaking on the memory as the resistance, social movement, and cultural preservation, I think it's important to present our personal memory and our collective memory. As a Tibetan, we have a collective memory of Tibet, and as a human being, we usually share a collective memory of the whole world. So I think it's really important to share our own story and also the history of Tibet. So Tibetans we have a memory of struggling for more than 70 years, and I think we're still on the road and we'll still have to go for a long time. So for the past week of July 6th, we had a wonderful week of celebrating His Holiness' birthday around the world. Especially the main event is taking place at the Dharamsala, where CTA located, and we got a lot of cakes. So I was eating so many cakes for the past week, and I think I gained some weight. And I think it's important to share our own story and just share my story. That's me right there. That was in Tibet. I was in Tibet. I was born in Lhasa. That's in Lhasa. It's not, you may see it, it looks like a nomadic life, but this was Lhasa back in 90s. And that's how you see like Tibetanness still exists during that time. And I did my schooling in Lhasa, and the education system back then and now it's completely changed, and I can share some of the stories later. Then the story of escaping to India. So I'll choose a picture of Nangpala, which is one of the worst fact that some of the, I think it's German mountain climbers, they found it out. There's a bunch of Tibetans who are escaping to India. Usually they walk a month and a half. I was lucky because when I escaped, I was crossing the border and I only spent 7 days and nights to walk. Although a lot of people feel that that is fascinating, but Tibetans in general, there are thousands and thousands of Tibetan children that are escaping through the Himalayan range, and they're usually spending a month and a half, and some of them actually losing their feet, their fists in the snow. So when this event happened, there are border patrols, and they're actually shooting Tibetans who are escaping. And if you can just Google Nangpala escape, you will see the whole video. And from India to Brooklyn, it was a culture shock when I just started my high school here in the United States, especially in Brooklyn. Brooklyn Bushwick back then is considered what do you call it, as a hood, and it was really tough. But then, because of His Holiness teaching, and I was able to, get really easy with the transition, and I was able to live in the diaspora community of Tibetan community in New York, and I started working for Tibetan communities in New York and New Jersey, and then I was helping my predecessor, Kundera, who was the Chinese liaison officer back then. The Chinese liaison office, Chinese outreach work actually started in 2008. Because of 2008, there's a really big purchase around the whole Tibetan plateau back then, and that kind of brought the whole Tibet together, because China actually divided Tibet into different regions. A lot of people know Tibetan autonomous region, but they didn't know about the Sichuan part of Tibet. They didn't know about the Qinghai part of Tibet. They didn't know about the Kansu and Yunnan part of Tibet. During that time, the whole Tibet is kind of brought together, and the protests actually took place in 2008. And China was trying to create a hatred between Han nationalists, and the Tibetans. And there were Tibetans who were trying to visit Beijing and some of the Chinese cities, and they're actually not allowed to book a hotel or go to most of the public spaces. And the reason why the Chinese outreach work started, we're trying to reach out to the Chinese people and let them know about the factual status of Tibet. Then let me, as a collective memory, I think it's important to share our Tibetan history. There's a reason why I actually put some of the words in Tibetan, because Tibet is completely different from Chinese. Because you have the Tibetan language, which is actually derived from one of the Sanskrit. And at the time when Tibetan was derived from Sanskrit, they used the vast script back then, which is called Devanagari script. And to start with the Tibetan history, I think it's important to talk about Dharma kings, the three Dharma kings. And Tibetan, it was the first Tibetan dynasty, Yalung dynasty, was actually started in Tibet. And the first king was Nyatu Sembo, a king of Tibet, and he was a legendary king who actually started the Yalung dynasty. And the time we usually consider it's actually 127 BC. So it has a long history back then. And then these three kings are considered the Dharma kings, three Dharma kings, when Tibet was really thriving and becoming the Greek empire of the Central Asia in 7th to 9th generation. So Songtsen Gampo, maybe a lot of Chinese, if you speak Chinese and read Chinese history, then you know about Songtsen Gampo, who actually married to a Chinese princess. Songtsen Gampo actually married to a Chinese princess, and in China, CCP is using that story to make Tibet as part of China, but it's really groundless, and they're actually changing the narrative later on, and now they're telling Tibet is part of China since antiquity, which they actually can't put any ground level where to trace back. And then we have, as I told you, Tibetan language was derived from the Devanagari script. And most importantly, our Tibetan culture is really based on Buddhism, especially came from India. And at the time of King Chisongdesen, the 38th king, he actually were, I would say, discussing about whether to adapt Chinese Buddhism or the Indian master of Buddhism. And he actually have debate the two schools of thoughts to debate together. And you, as on the table, you have Chinese Hashang. Hashang, we call it in Tibetan, we call it Chinese Hashang, which is actually concentrated on Zen meditation. And then you have the masters coming from India who actually teach us how to practice Buddhism and in terms of Buddhist thoughts and practical philosophies. And then somehow the king choose Buddhism who actually came from India and expelled all the Chinese scholars or the Hoshang back then from Tibet. And then from the 41st king, he started the translation. It was probably between 38 and 41st king, and there's a huge translation of Buddhist texts from the Sanskrit, from Sanskrit to Tibetans, and that's the whole culture actually built on. And after the dynasty, we have some more dynasties, as Sakya, Pamudrugpa, Rebumba, Tsangpa, and Galim Pojang ruled Tibet. But basically, it was it was actually an administration that was ruled by the different schools of thought, which is Nyingma, Gyu, and Sakya and Gelug tradition. Then we came to 1949, and China started invading Tibet from the eastern part of Tibet, the eastern part of Tibet from Dome and Dodo in 1949. And in 1959, China is kind of wholly occupied Tibet, and there was a time that Chinese was planning to kidnap His Holiness at the time, and that made His Holiness to escape from Tibet to India. And in India, His Holiness started to building a democratic society of Tibetan community in exile, and he started building. When you talk with the Nehru was really kind enough to start a separate school system for the Tibetans to preserve their culture and Tibetan traditional way of learning language and cultures, and rebuilding the Nalanda tradition to rebuilding the schools of Tibetan Buddhism, which was in India, which was in Tibet, and it was built in all the settlement in India. Let's talk about over 70 years of resistance and culture preservation. Oops. So in Tibet, we say after 1959, there are 90% of monasteries were destructed by the CCP, and 1.2 million Tibetans were killed. When we say that, there are a lot of people say you need to. Did you ever make a head count of 1.2 million people? But when we look back in history, when Hitler killed that many people, how can we count every single one of them? It's really hard to count it. But I think when we made a head count, like number to number, we came to like 600,000 people. There are a lot of them still unknown to us. And I think it's important to describe the different narrative and political ambition of different leadership of CCP. And at Mao Zedong, of course, their intention is to invade Tibet, and Mao Zedong was able to do it. During Deng Xiaoping's time, it is considered that Tibet has freedom, little bit freedom, as well as in China, there's a better way of freedom at the time. And Deng Xiaoping is actually told brother of His Holiness that negotiation will be accepted if you are not talking about independence. And then we came to Jiang Zemin's era, and Jiang Zemin was convincing His Holiness to accept Taiwan as part of China, and the history fact of Tibet as part of China, and His Holiness didn't accept it. And then we came to Hu Jintao's era, that from 2002 to 2008, we have Sino-Tibet dialogue took place. And Xi Jinping's policy right now is one nation, one language, and one culture. I have so many slides that I didn't finish, but I think the time is running. But let me just go over really quickly and show you what's happening inside Tibet, education policy and religious policy. And as I told you, we actually built a democratic system in exile Tibetan community, and CCA is actually the administrative body which governs the whole democratic system. That's some changes that happened in democratic system of CTA. I think my time is up, so I will stop right here. And if you have any question, I will answer that later. Thank you.
So thank you to the three presenters for the really moving and amazing presentation. I personally really want to thank you all for adding your personal touch and personal story in this presentation. I am very enjoying this. And next, I want to take the privilege of a moderator to ask some burning questions that's rooted in my heart to our great panelists. So you all touched on a very important context to the diaspora community, especially Anna. You mentioned the challenges and opportunities operating in a third country. For diaspora and exile community, when you're not actually inside of the PRC territory, but you're also not in your homeland, and you are operating in a country either have some cultural similarity to your host country, your own home, or not. And in my opinion, there are some unique opportunity and challenges in that. And I do want to bring up one of the fresh and painful incidents in the Taiwanese American community, which is the Presbyterian church shooting that happened in Las Vegas in May. To me, that is a really significant example of the unique challenges that Taiwanese American diaspora is facing, which is that, yes, it is an issue of identity among Taiwanese on whether they identify as more of a mainlander, Chinese, or a Taiwanese. But the shooting also, in my personal opinion, is also unique in the US context because it's related to the challenge that US domestically is facing, including gun control. It's related to the CCP reach globally. That includes the fact that the shooter was identified as has an affiliation toward the National Association for Peaceful Chinese Unification, which is an agency that was deemed by State Department in 2020 as a foreign mission of the PRC mission. So in my opinion, there are unique challenges, but also potential opportunities, as Eric mentioned, both in the third country that these diaspora communities are operating, hosting in, and also in other spaces, like online spaces. So I want to direct the first question to Eric. So for the Uyghur community, as far as I understand, they have been receiving some level of support from some neighboring country close to the Xinjiang region, but also some of the country that have some population who has some traditional historical ties or similarities in culture and language to the Uyghur population. So on that, Eric, what do you see as kind of like, how is the cultural preservation efforts going on there? What are some really impressive or interesting example you can share with us? And what might be some of the challenge for the Uyghur population to work or advocate for themselves in those countries?
Thank you for the question, and also again for organizing all of this. The largest Uyghur diaspora outside of Xinjiang, outside East Turkestan, there's Turkey and there's Kazakhstan, the two main host countries. And of course, for a long time, the linguistic similarities, the cultural similarities, the common background that Uyghurs had with Turkic peoples in both countries led to a lot of support in Turkey, which for a long time was a very effective base for organizing politically. Similarly, Kazakhstan, with a very large cross-border population, has always been a natural home for people who might be fleeing the CCP or might simply be visiting cousins, for that matter. And after 2017, yeah, we did see these spots both as increased sites of activity. The bookstores I showed you are in Istanbul, and Istanbul remains a central publication. And of course, in these countries, you also have, political interests, especially in the right wing in Turkey, who are interested in emphasizing this kind of pan-Turkic connection, maybe cynically for political purposes, but it also gives some concrete support to Uyghur organizations. In more recent years, however, as the movement has become much more active and has become less of a small, containable, sort of boutique diaspora government in exile, it's become more of a grassroots, honest effort at widespread political organization, they've received backlash from both countries. Kazakhstan has actively threatened and put down people who are organizing to find where their relatives are back in the homeland. Turkey is no longer considered a safe country among many Uyghurs, who are now trying to find ways to get to a third country out of widespread concern that they will be extradited to China. There's a treaty, I won't waste your time with the extradition treaty. And so I think those have been major challenges for the Uyghur community. And similarly then, okay, so where's the safe haven? There's the US, Australia, Canada perhaps. These can be safe havens. I think there's also the risk when you operate in a country like the US of also having your movement appropriated by certain political forces. So what I've seen is that the Uyghur diaspora has gotten very nimble at figuring out where to operate and who's an honest or trustworthy actor, at least in the short term or in the long term. But I'll put one more point in here. There's a constant question, which is where is the Muslim solidarity, right? Uyghurs are not getting support from most Muslim countries who have decided instead to often vocally support China's efforts in the region. And that is a challenge that people are working on, especially in countries like Malaysia and Indonesia, to find a broader base of support. But it's really been a struggle.
That's very fascinating and interesting, and provide a lot of insights of potential opportunities where we can work on more to support the Uyghur diaspora. And next, I want to talk a little bit about kind of like what we touched on in the panelist presentations about identity. There was spoken, the panelists spoken about the collective identity and how important that is to sustain and continue these movements, either overseas or in different host countries. And one of the questions that's dear to my heart, I want to direct to Anna, is that as a, I may say that Hong Kongers, for those who come into exile, these happen relatively new in recent years. And I see a lot of effort from HKDC, from other Hong Kong organizations, at least in the US and in other countries, to cultivate this Hong Kong identity, which you already also stressed a lot in your presentation. But with my experience in working with the Taiwanese American community, I am curious about how that's going and how have you been cultivating this Hong Kong identity, considering that a lot of your population, diaspora population base are either newly exiled, relatively younger generations, but also there are some other early immigrants who left Hong Kong earlier, and the Hong Kong they left is a completely different Hong Kong from the Hong Kong that you left. So how do you work among these different generations and different types of immigrants or exiles, and how do you bring together the Hong Kong population and cultivate the collective Hong Kong identity?
First, thank you so much for your question, and I definitely think, the generational conflict or the difference between the people who have moved overseas a long time ago versus people like me who just recently moved here is very real. That's very embedded in our diaspora. And in fact, I think a year ago, actually on June 12th or June 4th or July 1st, these are very important dates in Hong Kong. And there were a lot of debates on how we want to do it properly, because for people who have moved here and been organizing here for a long time, they have a very certain idea of how it would be conducted. But for people who moved here very recently, including frontline protesters who were, are really fighting against police violence on the front line, they had a completely different idea, and some of them wanted to be more out there and outspoken about what we want, for example, fighting for independence and things like that. And there are definitely a lot of tension between these two camps. But I think right now, after a year of everyone trying to understand the differences, it has kind of come to a consensus in our diaspora that we'll all just do what we want to do, because we're still relatively new in our phase. We're still kind of like an infant in terms of building a diaspora. So I think right now what everyone believes in is just no matter what our ways or means our goal is the same, that we want to liberate Hong Kong. And everyone has their ideal theory of change that they want to adopt. Some people believe in advocacy more. Some people believe in international advocacy at the UN. Some people believe in preserving culture as a priority. And with different people with different priority, it actually works better that everyone has a sort of spot that they want to fill and a sort of gap that they want to fill. So I think right now, really, people have fallen into, different positions in the diaspora. So people who have been in the US for a much longer time, they would be taking up more responsibility in terms of building a community and doing communal support where they can find the resource to support the newly exiles and the political refugees, for example. And for people who just moved here recently, they would perhaps take up a spot more on advocacy and doing, more protest organizings and sharing their very real stories on the front line with people on the streets. So I think we have come to find our collective, not collective, but our individual space in this collective identity to really preserve our culture. But another point that I want to bring up is that I think hearing what the other panelists have talked about, what I noticed is really there are two perspectives to really remembering or advancing our culture. So to make sure that our identity sustain and can continue, there's a part of it that you have to archive or remember what happened in your homeland. So that is in the city of Hong Kong. But on the other hand, you have to actively push for it and actively create more cultural products, even when you're abroad. So for the Hong Kong community, really for the archive or the remembering part, there are digital archive for news from Apple Daily and Stan News, and these are news agents that have been closed down and shut down by the government forcefully. And there are also people, trying to promote films that were made in Hong Kong when Hong Kong was still relatively free. But on the other hand, there are people actually creating new platforms. So for example, there's a magazine called Flow, which is actually made outside of Hong Kong, but it's entirely about Hong Kong. And there are also people in the diaspora trying to make new films, even though they cannot really shot any scenes in Hong Kong. So that would be a challenge for them to really try to make a film about Hong Kong without any street scenes of Hong Kong. But there are people trying to do these different things to, on one hand, preserve what we had experienced together, but on the other hand, to pave new paths on what can mean as Hong Kongers. And I think it is always going to be a constant construction of the identity of Hong Kong, and I believe that is the same for both Tibetan and Uyghur and Taiwanese diaspora as well. And I believe even though we all have our differences, but in the end, it's actually the diversity of the different interpretations of being a Hong Konger that matters. And it's the diversity that makes Hong Kong so special as well. So I believe it could be a problem, but at the same time, it's an opportunity to have different voices from people of different lived experience.
Thank you, Anna. That's an amazing remark. Lastly, and my last question, I kind of want to bring the attention to the youth part, considering us sitting on stage is quite young and you are quite young too, and this is a youth event. So I do want to bring the attention to kind of like the initiative that was mentioned in all of your presentation of the impressive work of the younger generations have done. And I want to direct this question to Sultram because I'm constantly amazed by Tibetan communities' identity and their solidarity among the community. While Tibetan community has been in exile for decades, but in my workspace, I've met so many young Tibetans in like 18 or 19 years old who probably never been to Tibet, but they still have such a strong identity, passion to advocate for their homeland. And I do want to ask Sultan about your experience and in your community. How did you guys? What's the secret sauce for success? Like, how did you guys did that? How did you guys do that? It's just really amazing, and I believe your experience in the Tibetan community can shed some light to other community as well.
Thank you for the great question. I was really lucky to see all different races of Tibetans, the Tibetans who are in Tibet, how they preserve Tibetan culture within the restriction of all this restriction and all this pressure coming from CCP, and how Tibetans are actually preserving their culture and language in India and other diaspora locations. So what I see is constantly telling youth about your culture, the importance of keeping the language and keeping the culture. And like my parents, they always tell me about how the kings back then having a really thriving history of Tibet, and then they tell us the importance of just keeping the language and culture to that Tibetans exist in this world. So I believe one is definitely the constantly telling of our elder generation to the youth, younger generation, and the other thing is the younger generation is so strong in their feelings about all these things are happening inside Tibet. There are 160 self-immolations happen inside Tibet, and that's one of the sort of reasons why Tibetans outside who have never ever seen Tibet, they're still feeling about Tibet because it's so strong. I think the international community should actually bring the self-immolation stories up, but it's actually not showing that much in the news and medias. But I think this sort of strong feelings that is introducing from inside Tibet is the reason why keeping outside Tibetans are so passionate about advocating about our movement.
Thank you. So next I want to open the floor to the audience, both online and in person. We have about 15 to 20 minutes left. If you have any question, please raise your hand and state your affiliation. Thank you.
Yes, thank you so much for this insightful session. My name is Han-Byung Koo. I am currently studying history at London School of Economics and Political Science. I actually have a question for Dr. Shuso. So I understand that language and, say, printing culture played a significant role in, say, building or forging the imagined community, especially in Europe or elsewhere. But I also assume that other factors such as military power or even mapping played another significant role in terms of, say, forging the identity or the imagined community itself per se. And what I understand is that, like, other than any other places, such as, say, Italy or Germany, say, Xinjiang is quite a lot city-sized, and the presence of the Chinese government in Xinjiang is pretty visible compared to, I don't know, Germany or Italy back in the 18th century. How does it fit in this, I don't know, theory? So, like, I kind of read an article saying that the Chinese government actually moved a lot of Han-Chinese people to Xinjiang deliberately, and because of that, like, Xinjiang is kind of dominated by those Han-Chinese other than, say, Turks. And if so, like, how people in Xinjiang, I don't know, cope with the situation in terms of forging their identity through language and printing culture?
Thank you for the question. I'll try to keep it brief. To make a long story short, that story of print culture you're talking about, the imagined community, happened very much independently and in the medium of Turkic, in the case of East Turkestan. Beginning from the late 19th century, and it really took off in the 1930s. First through the agency of Turkic nationalists, but then also through printing sponsored by the Soviet-controlled Chiang Kai-shek government, which is interesting, because on the one hand, it's remembered as a period of great oppression, but also a period in which Turkic language writing and printing kind of flourished. It was a time when the greatest poets and intellectuals of the Uyghur community were often murdered by orders of Stalin. But it's also one that created a lot of this literature and sort of institutionalized Uyghur identity and gave power to it in the way that the Soviets often did to their minority nationalities, right? And they helped set the mold, I think, going forward. Many of my older Uyghur friends back in Urumqi talk about how they remember reading Anna Karenina And they remembered reading Pushkin. They remember reading all these wonderful Russian authors because their textbooks when they were kids in the 50s were still basically from the Soviet Union, translated from Soviet work. So there's this funny trajectory where elite Uyghur culture was kind of formed by this combination of native writers and an admiration for that broader constellation of Russian Soviet literature. That's in part because actually the region wasn't that Sinicized until quite recently. The Chinese population was minimal until the 1980s and the real mass in-migration that you're referring to. That in-migration has largely been focused in the north and cities there, and on certain areas controlled by the Xinjiang Production and Construction Corps. But a lot of the major cities that we think of as capitals of Uyghur culture have still been majority Uyghur until very, very recently. And so on the one hand, there have been all these spaces in urban areas outside of the centers where you can just be Uyghur and be in the region. And in fact, it's possible to live entirely in the Uyghur language in a lot of places. This was until recently. In the north, however, say in Urumqi, where the population is, I think, 87% Han Chinese, it's extremely high in the capital, Uyghur intellectuals have always told me, when you go to that city for university, that's one of the places where you discover your Uyghur identity, because you come from many places, Kashgar, Aksu, Yarkand, Khotan, Turban, whatever, and you meet people who speak a language like yours and have an experience like yours, but are from different areas. And that common discovery of identity is also mediated by that print culture, is mediated by the reading, the repetition of common histories, often told in the form of historical novels. Now, this is all kind of erasing the bigger common tradition of manuscript culture and pilgrimage, which is a whole other book. I have reading recommendations for you. But I hope that answers the question, and I'll just leave it there for now.
I'm Hohan Lee from National Taiwan University. I have a question not really a question, but I would like to ask you to reflect on some, because you mentioned Muslim solidarity. And then, so we know that so I'm trying to compare the situation between Rohingya and Uyghur. So Uyghur people's trial was held in London when it received really little attention from international press. On the other hand, the Rohingya crisis was brought by Gambia on behalf of the Organization of Islamic Cooperation to the International Court of Justice. So we can see there is a selective approach in terms of Muslim solidarity between Islamic countries. On the other hand, we also saw a lot of critiques regarding the fact that the Western world officially condemns the Xinjiang situation while remaining quieter regarding Rohingya crisis. So we can also see the selective approach from the Western world regarding human rights violations. But then we actually listen less from people inside Uyghur community and Rohingya community. So I wonder whether you have ever heard or witnessed any reflections on this kind of solidarity between both communities in exile. Thank you.
Thank you. And again, I'll try to keep it brief. I'm not personally aware of Uyghur Rohingya solidarity per se, although I've heard people reflect on this problem. And look, I've heard everyone has the same answer to why it is that so many Muslim countries are quiet on the Uyghur issue. And Pakistani analysts have the same answer as Uyghur diaspora members themselves, have the same answer as a lot of American analysts, have the same answer as, honestly, some pretty honest Chinese analysts I've met. It's money. The integration of Chinese, the importance of Chinese money and investment and connections with the Belt and Road really does take precedence over other political concerns for many of these countries. After something like the US, America can stand at a distance and make a lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, like a lot of noise about the Uyghur issue if a politician wants to have a simple cudgel to beat China with. I often say a lot of politicians are very anti-China, but they're not pro-Uyghur enough. They're happy to use this issue to make sound and pose, but then they're not actually obliged to do much of anything because they say, well, it's China, we can't possibly interfere. So I think that's a big part of it. You can do something about the Rohingya situation, perhaps, because Myanmar doesn't have a lot of money or foreign influence. But it's not an issue that's on people's minds very much, so it's not politically useful. right? The Uyghur issue is on people's minds is politically useful, but most countries are not interested in getting into a conflict with China over it.
So let's get the mic to Deepa. And after that, I have a question from our online participants.
Deepa Lovely from Seeger Center. Thank you for those passionate and poignant presentations. Listening to all of you, one thing that struck me is that the Hong Kong Uyghur resistance is by, in some sense, taking place on social media and in the virtual world, which we have not really, the prospects of it, we don't know. Whereas in comparison to Tibet, which has been very much, it really has a community, a sponsor, a place where you can, in India, and which allows the culture and so forth to be reproduced and sustained in a slightly different way. And I just wonder to what extent, Eric and you see the prospects for those movements that you're talking about, because it does not have, and I'm hearing that it's actually quite difficult to have a alternate place of community and physical togetherness that I assume is very, very important in Tibet. And one small question for you, Sultan, is since 2017, has the refugee influx been much more reduced because of greater restrictions by China? Because again, unlike in Hong Kong, where there's a movement, a new and kind of regenerational thing, whether that's going to affect if there are very few new refugees coming out, how does that affect the movement? I know it's a large question, but maybe each of you could take a quick stab at it. Thank you.
Refugees coming from Tibet to India is reduced so much. When I was escaping from Tibet to India, during those years, we usually have like thousands of Tibetans are actually escaping from the border, even though it's taking a month and a half to cross the whole Himalayan range. But starting from 2008, and especially the Nangala shooting happened, and then 2008, the protests, and later on, all the border issue between Indo-China borders, there's less and less Tibetans that are actually able to escape from Tibet to India. Last year, I think there are only less than 10 refugees who were able to escape from Tibet to India. So, one reason is definitely because of the border is so strict, and the second reason is I think because of all these shootings happening and kind of scared the Tibetans to escape. And I'm sure there are a lot of Tibetans that are still willing to take the risk, but it's really hard to tell what actually will happen in the future because of all this geopolitical change and how the policies, the Chinese policies implemented in Tibet will stay. So all we actually depends on how the policy shifts.
Yeah, and I will also, answer some of the questions. Thank you so much for your question, and thank you for, pointing out the difference. And I do agree that the Hong Kong diaspora so far has been more based on the virtual space and internet communication. And I think part of it is because that was actually practice we have gotten from the movement in 2019. Because in the 2019 movement, which was mostly decentralized, a lot of mobilization took place on the internet. So for example, I still remember, even though I was studying in New York at the time, and I wasn't actually in Hong Kong in the very beginning of the movement, but I was actually able to organize how protesters would move and their paths online, even though I was in New York, just because I can use Google Map and I can watch, Facebook Lives to really formulate and understand what the on-the-ground movement is like. And I think because of that network that was mostly decentralized and underground and anonymous protesters, it has sort of become a norm for the pro-democracy Hong Kong crowd to continue to use platforms like Telegram or Signal to continue communicate and continue seeing if there's space to organize and do different things. And also, I think because we have, I think, really had a successful online presence back in 2019 to make sure the world knew what was going on in Hong Kong. So most people wanted to or want to continue that sort of cyber organizing to make sure that this event or what's going on in Hong Kong is not only known to a typically small crowd, but instead we want to amplify what we have been doing by bringing everything onto the internet. So that is why I think mostly so far, I think a lot of things were reliant on internet organizing. But on the other hand, I think it is also by limitation because Hong Kong is just a city with 7.5 million people. Is not a lot of people, and people who are pro-democracy, I would say, give or take, like between 4 or 5 million people. And among them, of course, not everyone has to go into exile, or not everyone can afford moving to another place. And when there are multiple countries that people can choose to move to, for example, a lot of them have moved to the United Kingdom, where there was a scheme to support Hong Kongers because Hong Kong was essentially a British colony before. But a lot of people also go to Canada, the United States, and Australia. And because there are so many readily available countries that people can choose from, in effect, it means that each country only gets a small amount of Hong Kongers. And inside of each country, for example, in the United States, in every single state, you only get like a handful of hundreds of Hong Kongers. So it has become quite difficult for people to come together physically because we're so spread all around the world. And also just because of, it's just difficult to have a time when people are still settling down in terms of finding a job or, finding a place to stay even. And that's why I think mostly so far we have just been focusing on online organizing because it's the most convenient and it can get past national borders. But even with that said, I think our community is trying to have more physical gatherings. So for example, some people just newly opened a community center on the West Coast that allows people to get together and take language classes or, just hang out together and something. And we also have been having a lot of film screenings. For example, we organize screenings in, I think, 20 different cities around the US and to give opportunities for people to get together. So I think the community is going to be more physically intimate, but still, I think because we were a very rapid or very, quick-paced city and because we're mostly organizing online, I think going forward, I cannot really imagine the Hong Kong community becoming a fully, physical community that will always go to get together, but instead will be more hybrid. But mostly, I think the cohesiveness really comes from the internet and the virtual space.
So I'd like to reflect some of that optimism and say, I think that youth in particular are very nimble at navigating these online spaces. That's amazing what you did from abroad, for example. In the Uyghur case, there's a lot of wonderful, you can make something really professional online. A lot of people who get into this have training as social media managers or in marketing. So they're finding roles in the movement to use professional skills as well. And it leads to things like face-to-face organization. The Uyghur American Cup soccer tournament was held outside of DC last fall, for example. And we just had another soccer tournament up in Toronto. So there are ways that the community comes together on a regular basis to enjoy things. And that's organized through the internet. And it still enables that kind of coming together across space. But I'll sound a little note of pessimism here, which is that grassroots activism is not very well paid. In all seriousness, and if you're growing up in the diaspora in a place like America, and in your 20s or your 30s, you're broke right now, and you're going to be broke for the foreseeable future. I speak as I'm 38, I know what I'm talking about. And so there's a real lack of money in a lot of these online things, right? It takes a lot of dedication. And that can lead to a lot of burnout. When people are relying on GoFundMes and things like this to get their work done, to maintain these professional spaces, I think the space itself is sustainable, but are the people going to be able to keep it up in the long term without a real infusion of cash? I don't know. You're never going to get the same attention with a website as you will with a brick and mortar think tank.
Yeah, Eric's point touch on, I see a lot of NASA staff nodding their head because this flag is not by volunteers, so what the struggle that Eric mentioned is real. We only have a few minutes left, and I want to open the space for one of our online participants, and then we can go to Quentin's question. Pengshun, hi Pengshun from National Democratic Institute online has a question for Tsoltrim. She mentioned that she's more engaged in the Tibetan movement, and one of her great inspiration is a cultural resistance from within the Tibet, despite the huge oppression from PRC. And she wondered if Tsoltrim can share a little bit more on that and how it affect and uplift the Tibetan community in exile.
So in Tibet, after the invasion, preservation of culture and the language was actually was really hard to do it because of the harsh policy of China. But when in the 80s we did have a little bit of freedom to kind of got some freedom to preserve the culture and language, and especially Panchen Lama was there to let all the Tibetans learn Tibetan, and he was every single event that he go to, he will tell the Tibetan youth to study Tibetan and study all the Tibetan Buddhist texts, and to keep the identity. And that was the reason why there was an age then a lot of Tibetan literature scholars were actually born in the 80s, and then actually a lot of them was able to escape to India, and they were pretty much connecting the exile and the Tibetan inside Tibet community together. And that was the reason why there's a time that the literature war of Tibet was so thriving at the time. So I think in that kind of sense, what happened inside Tibet is having a lot of effect to the diasporic Tibetan community, especially inside in India and pretty much all over the world. There are, under the CTA, Central Tibetan Administration, back then we call it the Tibetan Exile Government. It's a democratic system we built up for us pretty much 70 years now, and under one administrator, all the Tibetan people around the world are listening to the political leader, and of course, there's no doubt about all the Tibetans will listen to his holiness guidance as he's the spiritual, and back then he's the political leader. I wasn't able to show you the slides when I want to describe the CTA structure. So in 2001, his holiness actually said he's semi-retired and he will give the political power to the people elected political leader by then in Samdormichi. And in 2011, his holiness said he will totally give his political power to the elected leader of Tibet, which was elected by Tibetans. And in that sense, it's a structure and system we built up in India, and that representing the whole Tibetans in diaspora and in India. So that's pretty much the reason why every Tibetan is keeping together on the movement.
And then the last question.
Thank you very much for this wonderful set of presentations. My name is Quentin Huang. I'm from the Asia Pacific Foundation of Canada. And I guess all three of you have talked about identity consolidation and cultural preservation. But I'm curious about the underside of that, which is the question of inclusion. And particularly in all three movements, I think there's some sort of differences between people who face similar oppressions. And I'm curious about how these movements, these diasporas, sort of handle those differences. So, for example, in Hong Kong's South Asian minorities who have lived in Hong Kong sometimes longer than many sort of people who are ethnically Chinese in Hong Kong, Kazakhs and Kyrgyz in the Uyghur region, and in other distinct indigenous groups in Tibet. I'm curious about sort of where they fall in the diaspora movements.
I think this is definitely a really great question, and there were actually for Hong Kong during 2019 and 2020, there were a lot of discussions, I think, on how our community reflects on how we examine the situation of including others. Because I think before the movement, there was a certain, I would say, racist tendency for Hong Kongers, Han Hong Kongers against Hong Kongers of different racial descent. But in 2019 movement, there were protesters that were not Han Chinese. And when people saw that, I mean, when protesters saw that, they thought, wow, we didn't know that Hong Kong could be so diverse. I think that really started and sparked some discussion, especially for the Southern Asians inside of Hong Kong, that they were feeling a bit more included, and finally they were given space and attention to really share about their experience of having lived in Hong Kong and being treated as an outsider, even though they have lived in Hong Kong for their entire lives. And I think that was a good turning point to really open up a bit of the discussion. But still, I would say that in the Hong Kong community, inclusion is definitely still a problem we wrestle with and struggle with. And I myself would like to think in the way that even though right now we're in exile, we are trying to really resist against CCP's regime. But for me, I think at the moment, whatever we're doing right now is actually constructing the future Hong Kong we want to have. And that is the Hong Kong after the liberation. So what kind of Hong Kong are we actually envisioning here, right? And that is actually some values that we have to start incorporating into our diaspora. So for myself, I envision a Hong Kong that is diverse and that includes people of all race and all orientation and everything. And at the same time, for that to happen, I have to actually start acting on it and working on it right now. And that is why I think for me, and I think for a lot of people in my generation, we do recognize the problem, and we do try to be more inclusive and be more sensitive on these issues, because if it is not us who try to change the discourse right now, it will be much harder to change it later on when Hong Kong is finally given a chance to liberate and start everything on our own. So I think that is a great question. Thank you so much for your question, really, because I think that is a very deep problem embedded in all diasporas, not only Hong Kong. And as June mentioned earlier about the very unfortunate and very sad incident that happened on the church shooting, I think that is just another example of how the problem of inclusion would play in diaspora, because we, as exiles right now, or when we start a diaspora overseas, we can firsthand experience what the effect of inclusion is and what racism looks like. So I think when the diaspora has more experience in this, we'll become more mindful in constructing our own society going forward.
I think similarly, the Uyghur diaspora has always had a lot of tensions in it. One of those visceral being, are Uyghurs from Central Asia, Soviet Central Asia, the same as those from East Turkestan? And should they be in solidarity, or is one purer than the other? I think that distinction has been collapsing over the past few years, but now there are political questions. Are we looking for the independence of a state called East Turkestan that includes Kazakhs and Uzbeks and Hui and all these other peoples, or do we want an ethno-state? Are Uyghurs indigenous is now a question that's very much in the minds of the Uyghur diaspora. Are we Muslims first, for example? Do people want independence? Or do they want the restoration of what they saw as the relative autonomy and rights that Uyghurs possessed before 2017 or before 2000 especially? These are all vibrant debates. I have optimism about them these days because I see that the discourse around these issues is being shaped increasingly by people who have training in things like law, right? And in economics, and people who have much better media experience and who kind of understand the nuances of these debates in different ways and kind of understand like the legal implications. So if you present yourself to the UN, for example, what are the consequences of presenting yourself as indigenous versus non-indigenous, right? These are different legal categories, they have different consequences. And so I think that these debates are playing out increasingly within institutions and within perhaps more productive fora. And moreover, this is why I mentioned Uyghur Anthology, that wonderful work, because I think that the younger generation, much as Anna is saying, is seeing the effects of racism around the world as people are being affected by racism in the countries where they move to as refugees, and are more mindful of what it means to exclude people. They're understanding the value of bringing people in and calling people into a dialogue and looking for common ground first. So I have a lot of hope for the Uyghur movement going forward on that account.
In terms of movement, we did a really good job. Tibetans did a really good job to include everyone, and that was the reason why there are so many youth generations so passionate about bringing Tibet on every level. They got a chance. So when they got a chance, and to introduce you the fact about Tibet, I think what people who are outside of Tibet is actually representing Tibet inside Tibet, because we're not able to hear Tibetans from Tibet how the sufferings are actually taking place in Tibet, and what the India-based Tibetans and the diaspora Tibetans are actually representing Tibet to bring their voice. And I think it'll be good to introduce you how Tibetans in United States and Canada are working, since our Office of Tibet represent United States and Canada. We have 33 different Tibetan associations in different state of United States and Canada, and they usually form a Tibetan community. And when there are a lot of Tibetans, they try to buy a community hall by themselves to make a center of Tibetans to, get together. And sometimes that community hall will become a school that the children to study Tibetan and study Tibetan culture, Tibetan dance and singing and all those steps. And Tibetans, I think that they did a really good job to include even those people, even those kids who were born outside of Tibet. If you are a Tibetan who were born outside of Tibet, let's say in the United States, England, your parents, if one of your parents are Tibetan, you have the right to hold a grain book. We call it grain book, which is almost like a passport to prove you that is Tibetan, which is given by the CTA in Dharamsala in India.
Thank you everyone for your participation today. We're a little bit over time. Please join me to give the great panelists a round of applause and to